Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are live from various places. We are Song and Beyond, the Hampson Foundation partnership with IDAGIO.com, and IDAGIO.com is, of course, the place where classical music happens. And if we ever had a happening show for you, it is certainly tonight, for two reasons. One, I deeply admire everybody on this screen. So it's my privilege, and it's a private party that I'm inviting you to. It's purely for my pleasure. And the other is it's a big bang finish to a year we're all pretty glad to say goodbye to. Meaning this is the last Tuesday show of Song and Beyond for 2020. So what better way to say happy holidays, auf Wiedersehen, à bientôt, and all that stuff until January, than to have a wonderful roundtable with some of the most accessibly entertaining, erudite scholars in the world of song that you can hope for. And yes, in no particular order, we have, and I'm going to leave all your titles out because we only have an hour. So I'm just going to say Susan Youens and Steve Rodgers and Laura Tunbridge and Ben Binder, and of course the inimitable Christy Finn of also scholarly repute and everything Hampson Foundation, and yours truly, Thomas Hampson. We're going to have a wonderful discussion about song. And just to kick it off, we've got some wonderful questions, and then they're going to talk. I promise I'm going to shut up. I want to tell you that what was so exciting about this whole project is when we rebranded. I mean, we've been doing this Tuesday thing since March, which you have been following. And thank you. It's been great that we've been able to do this. Ah, yes, bring the cat up. Can I have the cat? I'll hold the cat. I love it. But I don't know if you all know this, but this whole Tuesday song thing has generated its own public, its own quite significant numbers of people passionate about song, which, you know, we who love song want to believe that's the way the world goes around. But when we branded, we took the Hampson Foundation in partnership with IDAGIO.com, and we opened up the accessibility on the Facebook page. All of a sudden, we started having shows with 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 people, and hanging on and staying and just listening to a lot of interviews of the people you see here about some pretty specific stuff in the world of song. And that has, of course, given Chrissy and I enormous wind in our sails. But thank you. Not that IDAGIO ever gave any pushback. In fact, quite the opposite. I want to get really very forward here and thank IDAGIO.com for all the really hard work, heavy lifting, patience, and total pouvoir to go where we want to go with in this show. And it's been all this partnership of goodwill and common good that has made this series the fun that it is, where Christy and I can just invent the next week as we go along, but also have guests like this. So this is just a total wrap up, feel good. Let's dive some more into song. And yes, we will be back in January. And just to give you a little clue, we might talk about it in some more depth. January is Schubert month. It will always be Schubert month. It has always been. Look at Susan Youens just burst her bubble. It's wonderful. It is without a question Schubert month. And in fact, we are going to try and have some kind of birthday party for Mr. Schubert towards the end of January. And there'll be one session that'll be live from the Schubert week at the Boulez Saal with my wonderful students in our program. But all of that we'll tell you some other time. So without any further ado, Christy, I'm going to throw this off to you. You start the ball rolling.
All right. Well, thank you to all of you for being here. And it's so wonderful to do this at the end of the year. And all of your conversations with Thomas were really amazing, which is what helped us come to this idea of bringing everyone together and to bring up some questions that maybe we wanted to continue talking about. And one that came up in Susan's conversation was this idea of the bottomless well song that is endlessly fascinating, that you can continue to study and look at from all different angles, looking at text, looking at music, looking at the historical context and who's performed it and so many different things. And I would love to open up the floor and hear if and what your bottomless well songs are. Susan, would you like to start?
Sure. I actually have a number of them. Schubert's Der Winterabend is always going to be my desert island song, the song that keeps opening up to me in new ways as I get older, and the kind of gentle, good death depicted in that song, I hope, will be mine eventually, like 30 years from now. But right now, my Bottomless Well song is the latest one that I don't fully understand. And I go a little crazy if there is something in a beautiful song that I don't get, I don't understand why the composer did that in conjunction with those words. So right now, the Bottomless Well song is Hugo Wolf's Im Frühling, which is one of his settings of the poetry of Eduard Mörike, who is one of the greatest geniuses of 19th century German verse. And what this song does in a way that I don't fully understand yet is weave together various compositional strands until you culminate in a final acclamation, alte unnennbare Tage, which is very hard to translate. Old unmentionable days, past, bygone, past unnameable days. But all of the threads come together in those three enigmatic words. And I keep thinking maybe by the time I'm 80, I'll be able to figure this out. And until then, I'll just keep listening to it over and over and over again.
Yeah, please. Yeah, and let's throw all the spaghetti on the wall, and then we'll have a chat. Stephen, what's yours?
I'll chime in because Susan mentioned Schubert, and I think my Bottomless Well song is probably Schubert's Nacht und Träume, which is a very famous song. And it's interesting, some songs I think are Bottomless Wells because they're confusing to me. I don't get them. There's something really perplexing or puzzling. And then there are others, and Nacht und Träume is one of these songs that just sort of speak naturally and without complication. They're not easy to understand, but easy to feel. And yet I want to put my finger on what exactly the composer is doing to create that kind of feeling. And Nacht und Träume is one of those songs. It's just a gorgeous piece that just last night I was listening to different recordings of it, and just depending on the tempo that you take with this song, which can be very slow or not too slow, it can have a totally different mood, a totally different atmosphere. It has wonderful small touches, individual chromatic notes that transform the song in really wonderful ways. It's totally static because it's about night descending, and yet it also has a sense of forward momentum because of all those little touches. So I think that's the song that I could sit and play and sing on loop endlessly and always find something new to dive into.
By the way, when you were listening to all the different versions, did you happen to use the IDAGIO interface where if you put up Nacht und Träume and you take any recording, all of a sudden on the side, you've got all the rest of them that are in the database. Did you play with that?
I did, in fact. And
I love it.
It was really helpful because usually what I have to do is sort of search a different website and find certain recordings. And I just hit play and did the dishes while Nacht und Träume was playing on repeat. And every performance was a different revelation because of how the performers handled those subtle details in the song.
My little tease, ladies and gentlemen, is it really, however you want to access your music for whatever purpose, IDAGIO has a way you can do that. And it's a lot of fun. Laura, what's your Bottomless Well?
I want all of the ones that have just been mentioned. But I was actually
not an answer.
Oh, I know. Actually, and I was also hoping to dodge the answer by wanting a whole composer, because the composer I keep on returning to recently, but I mean for a long time now, is actually Strauss. And I love Strauss's songs. I find it really hard to find a way into talking about them, which I think actually captures what it is that I like about them. And so in some ways that's my bottomless well, and it really is bottomless at this point.
I love it. Ben.
These are great answers. So I want to co-opt everyone else's answers, as well as the approach to this question, because you could see it as something that is of historical interest and constantly provokes threads of thought into how the song reflects culture or biography or something historical. I think in terms of discovering new details every time you go back to a song, we talked about this last time when I was here for my solo interview, that I feel like at bottom I'm a performer. And so everything I do, especially my scholarly work, my research, I'm approaching it from the perspective of trying to understand a piece of music as a mode of expression. And sometimes that has good effects, and sometimes it has less than productive effects, actually. But so I'm always discovering new features in any repertoire that I need to come back and play. So it's a very hard question to answer, what one song always has something new to reveal, because as performers, that's our job, is to reveal something new. Otherwise, why would we perform these same pieces over and over again? Having said that, I thought about something that I think Laura is kind of pointing to with Strauss, the idea that you can go back over and over again, and there's just something ineffable, something you can't put your finger on that draws you to a composer or a song over and over again, and it never ceases to please you, which Susan and Stephen also said. So I have two pieces to put on the table, and it's Schubert and Wolf, so nothing very original there. The first is a Schubert's Liebesbotschaft, from the first piece from the Schwanengesang.
Yeah, wonderful.
To me, that is the quintessential lied, because it marries together beautiful musical shaping, melody, form. You could play that on a cello, as has often been done, and it wouldn't lose much. I mean, it really is, it coheres as a beguiling and enchanting melody, and not just something that's beautiful, but that has emotional ups and downs and a certain psychological weight to it, just as a piece of music. And yet, Schubert is also transliterating everything in the poem as though it were just like a heightened poetry reading. In other words, that the poetic and the literary dimensions of that song are working together and not pulling apart in any way. And I just find that sort of miraculous. And I think it's also something that Strauss, who was an opera composer and worked with his wife, singer, and who's a great singer, and as well as all these other incredible divas, that's also what gets at the ineffability of his success as a song composer too, although somewhat different than the way Schubert did it. But when I look at Botschaft, every measure is some little turn in the melody, some harmonic shift that just speaks volumes about the poem. And then the other example is kind of, it's sort of similar, so really brief to mention it, but Auf eine Christblume from the America settings. So again, I'm really not, this is how Susan influences all of us. We end up liking all the same things that she does. That was the first Wolf song I think I ever heard. I had a Elizabeth Schwarzkopf's live recital from the Salzburg Festival with Gerald Moore. It was the first song. And I just, kind of like Im Frühling, there's something enigmatic about that. What is this flower that is discovered in the middle of a, all alone, in the middle, unexpectedly, in the middle of this snow-covered field? what does it mean? And then there's an elf that comes in the end of the song, and just because there's all this sort of spiritual, religious, Christian trappings around it, and then the elf comes by and just critiques the whole scene that's just been painted. And sort of as something of an introvert myself, just the scene of the lonely flower and then discovering it alone and having there be all this meaning, and then the elf coming by to just throw the whole thing in a new light. The way that Wolf, again, harmonically transliterates all of this, where in every measure there are like 3 deceptive or surprising harmonic moves. It's just very hard for me to say in words how that has its effect, but it has a very.
I think you've done well. What I just to riff on that for a moment, that there's something about especially the Mörike Christian symbology poems. The miracle of Wolf is that he literally times the punchline. You know, you think the song is about something else because the poem acts like it's about something else, but actually, you know, it's about the next time you look at a tree, maybe it's going to turn into a cross, or the next time you look at a thorn, maybe it's going to be on Christ's head, and maybe the flower, and maybe the next, you know, it's just, it's an uncanny ability of Wolf to tell the story and protect the punchline as well, something that probably wouldn't have been possible much before him. Anyway, these are wonderful answers. Do any of you want to answer the other one? Is there something that pops up in your mind as we've talked about this? If we can go on, Nacht und Träume is a home run. Strauss, Strauss gets a lot of, I've spent an awful lot of time with Strauss. So Strauss gets as well, and I'm quite passionate about it. I have one of my best friends, also in music and theater and professor, can't abide Strauss. And I keep saying, that and he talks about the derivative melodies and so forth, and everybody sings it. I say, it's not Strauss's fault that he's so popular, and because of his popularity, that some songs we know extremely well. But if you actually look at this Strauss oeuvre, from the age of 6 to the age of what year is that going to be? 68. If he was born 64, so if we go from 1870 to 1949. When he died, he never not wrote songs. This is more interesting to me than this or that great hit. Is that how you feel about it, Laura?
Yeah, I'm really intrigued by the songs that we don't know so well. The fact that he does continue, throughout most of his career, but also you can tell that this is Strauss, who's the opera composer, but also there's something about the songs that do something slightly differently, that do sit in between voice and piano and voice and orchestra, that don't quite belong on the operatic stage, that sometimes have a great simplicity to them. And it's those qualities that you don't often think of with regards to Strauss, but they are the things that intrigue me.
Well, that Strauss, I just take him at his word, because he wrote all the time about Wort und Ton. And that's not necessarily some musical settings. That is this phenomenon. Is it possible that a harmony can resonate a particular emotional context? And if that's born out of a metaphor, that it's a word. I see him, experimenting with that and turning it inside out, especially after the really popular songs. Let's look at everything after Opus 40, it's just to me an amazing landscape. Susan, jump.
Laura, do you know Strauss's Ufer?
Yes, in fact, that was one song I was almost going to bring up as my bottomless well.
Ufer.
I love that song.
Yeah.
That's definitely a bottomless well song.
Yes.
And I think, Strauss gets a lot of calumny for not being an echt lead composer, whatever the hell that means. But Ufer is just one of the most gorgeous, genuine fusions of word and tone that I know, and yet so few people know it. How can we get word out? It's a stunning piece.
Hey, this could be a good game. Everybody name a couple of poems and a couple of songs that you think are unjustly not known. whoever composer. I mean, if you had to say, look, would somebody please program, I'll start, and this is taking a page out of Fischer Dieskau's book. I'm looking at the Seidel songs, and there's Im Freien and Am Fenster. And these are just magnificent songs. I mean, breathtaking, especially Am Fenster. It's like, why isn't this in everybody's recital of Schubert? So I've kicked it off. Who you just throw out a couple? Steve.
Mine would be, and this is somewhat well known, as at least in our circles, but Robert Schumann's Opus 90 song cycle.
I'm just learning those. The Lenau, Nicholas Lenau poetry.
Meine Rose is a beautiful song. The last song, the Requiem song, it has this moment at the end where theorists love this kind of thing, where the vocal melody descends to the tonic, but the piano undercuts it with this chromatic chord. It's just so extraordinary. And late Schumann, as Laura knows very well, is finally being recognized for the great music that it is. But that is just a through and through a terrific cycle that I would love to hear you sing.
Well, you will next September. Actually, I'll announce it. Andras Schiff and I are going after that. He just loves it. I've never looked at that. Just a bit of a cycle, a certain grouping. But anyway, I don't mean to keep crashing in on top of this. Laura.
Yes, for me it would be, well, the Strauss we've just talked about, but also late Schumann. I think still the Maria Stuart songs get done a lot these days, relatively speaking, but the Kuhlmann songs as well, I think are also, I just want people to hear them. I think there's a real charm to them and something that is both very Schumannian, but also slightly different from what he was doing 10 years before, that I think would be really nice to hear more often.
Susan, you probably got a list.
I do, of course. Of the late Schumann songs, I'm not sure how you would program this, but I am so captivated by Warnung, which is a very eerie political warning about the kind of tyranny that the state can exercise over artists. And it's a real foreshadowing of Mahler in certain ways. Mm. So both that and Herzeleid are two late Schumann songs that, I want to stand out on a street corner and hand them out to everybody. And as far as Schubert is concerned, I have a long list because so many voice teachers and singers stick to the same group of 10 famous Schubert songs. And I think one of his most stunning and beautiful songs is Die Gebüsche. And true. It's another example of Schubert, the genius, translating a concept into a stunning piece of music. Mm. It's born of the Schubert circle's flirtation with pantheism, the old Greek notion of hen kai pan, or the one and the all. And Schubert turns that into a harmonic and tonal scheme that exemplifies the one and the all. And it's utterly beautiful. He does everything to just open up the sound world to the infinite.
Well put. Beautiful. I remember Graham came over. Graham Johnson, our esteemed colleague, came to Heidelberg, and before he came, I said, "Can you give me a list of songs you think should be known that aren't known?" He and Richard Stokes were coming over, and 3 pages later, we had a good conversation, and that was also one of them. Ben, do you have what do you think? What 2 songs are just screaming at you that they should be performed?
Well, I feel like what is performed a lot and what is not is changing a lot. Like some of the songs that were real chestnuts, 30 years ago, or you'd hardly hear anymore, and then other songs really overtake them.
That's true.
But I think we made the case for late Schumann and Schubert. I mean, everyone is a gem, so it's hard to. There's, I could think of Fülle der Liebe as another Schlegel setting, but I think this.
If you want to riff on this, and what about, I've got a couple of composers that I think are ridiculously ignored today. Anybody want to jump on that? Ben, since I got you here, is there a composer that you love to sing that is just, or well, you know what I mean? I'm not going to say, I'm going to wait and see if any of you say my loving composer. Go ahead.
So we're thinking within the lead repertoire?
Well, I mean, we could go to the, fado repertoire of the Portuguese, but I think probably we should stay with the lead, yeah. Just being an ass, don't worry about it. Anybody else want to jump on this? Christy, you haven't said anything yet. You're a singer. You sing. I mean, just because you hold the fort together, you are a singer, performer. You know more repertoire. You sing all that stuff that most people can't. Certainly not me. But you also know the repertoire inside and out. That we've had that bonding from the very get-go. Wade in on this yourself. Have some fun.
Well, actually, I'd like to hear Stephen talk about some of the female composers he's been working on. Like, I thought maybe you would say a song of Fanny Hensel that wasn't known, or Josephine Lang, or someone like that. I think I'd love to hear more about that.
Sure. Well, I was thinking as we were talking about, I think we've mentioned only male composers so far, and there are so many great songs by well-known and less well-known female composers. One song this is of course a very well-known female composer, but there's a great song by Clara Schumann called Mein Stern, which has been published. It's interesting because it's a setting of a poem by a female friend. And it's always fascinating when women are setting poems by women. And it's just a gorgeous song that has such sweep. It's got a wonderful accompaniment that someone like Ben could play beautifully. I've been listening to a lot of Josefina Lang lately, and her songs are extraordinary. The person who knows most about them, the people who know most about them, are Harold and Sharon Krebs. They've written a great book about her songs, but every song I listen to is just a gem. She has this knack for writing songs. There's one whose title I can't remember, and it will come to me by the end of the conversation, that's in C major and has like barely a chromatic pitch. And it's like a world. It's a full expressive world with very minimal materials. And I think she does that remarkably well. So those are more Josefina Lang for sure. And that Clara Schumann song is not as well known as some of her others, although it's published, it's out there, and it's been recorded.
Did anybody not get to answer? And nice duck on the question, Christy, but I'm still going to circle back and shoot an arrow at you. Well, no one mentioned the composer that I'm thinking of, but Laura, did you weigh in on a composer you think that is more worthy than not?
Hans Eisler and Krenek. Probably.
Well said. Krenek, good for you. He had a time that was very popular, and of late he has a few things. But you're absolutely right. Eisler, of course, Matthias Gunnar did a tremendous service by the recording of the Hollywood Songbook. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is, and there's so much more to get to know. But they're also just fantastic songs. So small and experimental in some regards, and just so wide-ranging in terms of their poetry.
Why do you think that is? Is that because of his story, which is actually quite well known, and I guess the echo of ambivalence over his politics? Do you think that had? I mean, in America, certainly that has something to do with it. I promise you.
Yeah. And also, I think actually, I mean, Strauss aside, knowledge of lieder composition in the 1920s, 1930s, partly for political reasons, but I think also just because of fashions in music and what we associate those decades with, means that we don't think of art song, whereas actually one of the interesting things is that it was continuing to be composed and sung.
Right.
So I think there's a slightly different story to tell about those decades, but it is complicated by politics and how people move and what kinds of poets they're choosing. So there's lots of different complications.
An incredible amount to unpack with Iceland and getting into the 20th century. And I'm glad that we're moving the conversation a bit more to the 20th century. Also, I know all of your expertise, and we had other people that focused on this repertoire, but in all of your, and you still haven't said my composer, and you can maybe guess. I think Susan would guess it first. I'll give you a hint. When Lotte Lehmann retired from the stage with her famous, thank God, recorded town hall recital, 45% of her program that night was this composer. And for $10,
Robert Franz, right?
Bravo.
That's another composer. I can't remember the song I was playing recently. It was for a class I was teaching. I keep opening up new songs of his and finding these sort of one-page gems that are really, really great songs. And interestingly, I've had people say to me about Franz what people say about Strauss, that he's not that good of a composer actually. But I think he's great. I think you're right that those songs are deserving of more attention.
3 facts about Franz that I love is, 1, he was Wagner's favorite composer because he didn't mess, he just set text. He was deeply admired by his colleagues, and he fell into rather bad straits at the end of his life, and Liszt himself used to do benefit concerts with his colleagues to raise money for Mr. Franz to stay alive. And the last fact is complete and utter trivia you couldn't possibly know, but we share the same birthday, not year, just the date. Anyway, Susan, you want to jump in? Go.
Robert Franz is one of the great composers in setting Heine. And Heine is not easy to set to music. I'll never forget hearing Ben give an absolutely wonderful miniature rant at AMS to a speaker who didn't realize that irony in music has to be structured in such a way that it only comes through in performance. You have to perform it. It was just brilliant. I quote him used to quote him to my students all the time. But Franz's Heine settings are gems.
Ben, you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, now I'm just thinking of a ton of, if we're looking outside the big 5 or 6 lead composers, I mean, there's a ton of people you can talk about. You can talk about Löwe or Grieg, who's someone I thought of in terms of his German songs are
wonderful.
And they kind of fell out of favor, but they're just stunning. I think Reichardt and Selter sometimes get a bad rap, honestly, especially when we talk about performance and the opportunities they provide. But just on the mention of Heine, I would end by saying I've had occasion to look into Johann Wesk von Püttlingen's setting of all 88.
Püttlingen. I love it.
From Heine's Die Heimkehr. And there are some real
gems
in there too that take angles on the poems that you don't see in the other settings of some of these very famous poems. And Heine himself heard Wesk's settings and approved of them. There's actual evidence of that, not a ton, but some. Whereas we don't see that with the other, great composers, and I think that's meaningful.
Heine seemed to be very generous to the French translations of his poetry as well, and there's some wonderful French settings of Heine in French. Susan, please.
There's also an occasion on which Heine said that in French, his poems became moonlight stuffed with straw.
Oh my!
Which is quite the statement. But I was also going to jump in and make an argument for the songs of Franz Lachner.
Oh, yes.
a late in Schubert's life friend of his. And there are some really rather astonishing songs by him.
Look, Susan, because of that conversation we had, and because of your reference to Lachner, which was only in my radar as in the time of Schubert kind of thing, I went back and said, oh, really, seriously? And I went down a rabbit hole for a couple of days on this. I had no clue. I had no idea how long a life, how expansive a life, how musical a life this guy Franz Lachner had in all genres. And it's a wonderful story. Thank you very much for doing that to me. Christy, say something.
Well, I mean, I don't really want to jump in on the leader, but talk about a 20th century composer, and I'm going to take us a little bit off. I don't want to take us off track, but an American composer, Dorothy Rod Moore, whose songs are absolutely gorgeous, and I fell in love with them in 2017 when we were doing the live stream from the African American Music Conference in Irvine, and I couldn't do anything else when I was listening to them. I had never heard her before. She's I think she's in her 80s now. She's as fiery as ever, but
Wonderful.
her songs are just her song cycle from the Dark Tower is just breathtaking for contralto, cello, and piano.
By the way, I left a question dangling, and that was, despite all your expertises, do you have some casual awareness of American song, much less 20 minutes, or in your case, Laura, English song? Especially of the 20th century, is that something that comes up on your radar? Although you all have different expertises, Laura.
Yeah, it certainly comes up, both English and American song, and I find it interesting to compare, and also to compare attitudes, both to performance and how it's approached, but also just thinking about sort of relative status and popularity and things like that. So yes, it is very firmly on my radar. If I prefer to look at German language song or French, or that's just my own preference. It's not to say that there isn't a lot of interest in
No, I get it. Is there an English composer of song that sticks out in your mind as just he or she got it more right than not? And I mean, that's a silly thing to say, but you know what I mean?
Yeah,
I mean, is it Gurney? Is it Finzi? Is it, I mean, those are the big names, but is it Vaughan Williams?
They are the big names. They're not the composers who speak to me. And in fact, it's more contemporary people who I find respond to text in a way that means something to me. I find some of and this is just my own taste, that the 20th century English stuff, it's not my kind of poetry, it's not my kind of music, but that's just preference.
We're not going to disagree on A.E. Housman, are we?
I don't know, probably not.
I hope not. He's one of my favorite English poets of all time. Somebody who's raising a finger. Susan, jump.
I was just going to jump in and say that Butterworth's settings of A.E. Housman absolutely knock me to the floor every time.
It's true.
That set is just, if you can listen to it without crying, you don't have a soul.
Oh, I agree.
Be judgmental about it.
Anybody else? Yeah, Stephen.
I want to jump in. So this is very far away from the 19th century and very far away from German lieder. I taught a course this term for graduate students, mostly performers, and we looked exclusively at not just vocal music, but music by composers who are under 40 years of age. And I encountered some wonderful song composers that are well known in the world of new music, but not as well known in my world. Two of them come to mind. One is very well known these days. Caroline Shaw is a terrific.
She is wonderful.
Oh
my goodness.
There's a wonderful recording of a cycle of hers called Is a Rose with Anne-Sophie von Otter that is just amazing. And another composer who is kind of wild and crazy, or at least her music is wild and crazy, but really good, is Kate Soper. Kate Soper is a soprano who sings like these wildly jagged melodies that go from like, way below the staff up to like a high C, and really meticulously scored things for kind of chamber ensemble that are difficult at first to grasp. but really expressive. And her way with text is really astonishing. She has a great piece called "The Ultimate Poem is Abstract," which is based on a Wallace Stevens poem. So those are two very much living female composers, both Americans, who are really good. And it was such fun for me to dive into that repertoire this
Well
year.
done. Ben.
Yeah, I've played a lot of American song from, early 20th through today. And I mean, Barber to me is as central and canonic as anybody that we've mentioned so far today, personally. Something that I've worked on a little bit is I just, a book chapter just came out. I'm looking at the book now that I wrote about a song cycle by Scott Wheeler called Wasting the Night with Edna St. Vincent Millay. And one of the, thinking about that cycle, it's a piece that I performed with a soprano, Martha Guth, and we presented it at a conference. I was thinking about it and trying to situate it within the overall expanse of American song. And something that started to occur to me was that American song is to my mind, is a relatively conservative genre. Obviously not all figures, but when you think about art song in the early 20th century with figures like the Second Viennese School, it was a short form where the text could permit a lot of musical experimentation and modernism. And I feel like American song has generally, seems to be more not modernist, more lyric, more conservative. All of these words have sort of baggage that I'm trying not to bring into what I'm trying to capture here. But that is interesting to me that there's a kind of a strain of sentimentality or just sort of a unabashed lyricism that comes into American song that maybe you don't see. There are plenty of American modernists, but you don't see them writing art song. Whereas many other modernists at other times in music history did gravitate to this form precisely because it gave them a platform to experiment. And I just find that interesting. So this is something I've been thinking about in terms of the historiography of American song.
If I could digress for a minute, I'm sure that there are, literally a minute, I'm sure that there are a lot of young singers and students watching this show or will watch it. By the way, we do have a pretty good echo for the shows, and they stay up on our website, our Facebook, so you can revisit and so forth. It might be a good experiment, you young singers, to watch this, and as you're watching it, take notes. But I also just want to just point out that these are 5 phenomenal experts here, and they're all talking about, I just listened to this, or I'm re-listening to that, or I found that, or that sent me here, or this. This is the world of curiosity that song is all about. And if you're passionate about song, you need to just go down the rabbit hole all the time and just let your mind wander and listen. And I'm not just trying to push Adagio, but find your vehicle of choice. Adagio makes it pretty simple to jump around, but however you do it. I mean, I have a huge record collection, CD collection, because that's what we did in my generation. But you have so many tools at your hands to have this conversation with your colleagues. And that's what I would like to really encourage. Let's, Christy, shall we shift? What do you want? Should we shift to, all of you are experts. You're all extremely well thought of in your field and across music. You're all very successfully published, and people are quoting you all the time. And then we came along and said, well, we'd like you to write a radio program. And we made you sign an agreement knowing that you probably had no idea what we were asking you to do, that said, at the end of the day, we may have to cut this because we got 10 seconds too much, and the painful, amputation to save the patient kind of thing. What was there anything you learned in this crazy experience of writing a radio show that was completely different or outside of your comfort zone or anything else, but maybe illuminated? Is that the right question, Christine? Yeah. Anybody want to jump? Stephen.
Maybe I'll jump in. One thing I learned, and I think I mentioned this when we had our conversation, I learned the value of brevity. Saying things, and I mean, I kept having to cut, but it was like a meal that was good because it didn't have too many ingredients by the time it was done. It was as taut as it needed to be. So I learned the value of brevity, but I also learned that, I was thinking about this, often I think what we're doing is picking one thing and writing a lot about it, which is what's fun to do. Like you pick one song that's 20 measures long and you write like 5,000 words on that one song. And here I was pushed to have a kind of, to say a lot about a lot of things in a small space. So to have a kind of sweep of geographic locations, composers, topics, but do it very concisely. And that was a really fun exercise to kind of be broad, but very concise at the same time. And that has helped me with, even with advising students to, swing for the fences a little bit with this one, but that doesn't mean you need to write 10,000 words. You can do that in a short essay. So that combination of breadth, and the paradoxical combination of breadth and brevity was a challenge, but I learned a lot from trying it.
And by the way, keep going, all of you, but if there's any part that says, I hope I don't do this again, we're not offended. I mean, that's a legitimate, yeah, it was a good experience, but no, that's not what I do. Anyway, but I'm just putting it on the board. We want to hear honest reactions. Anybody else? Laura or Ben or whoever. Well, and Christy, for crying out loud, what did you wrote three shows, didn't you?
I wrote 4. I wrote 2 for Song of America, and I wrote 2 for Song Mirror of the World. And I think, I mean, my favorite one to write was the 89s, our concept of 1789, 1889, 1989. And I really loved, the shows got me to think of things not chronologically. And I think because, for instance, in the 89s, we opened in 1989 with Bernstein at the Berlin Wall playing Beethoven's Ninth. And then we went back to 1789, same location, Mozart's opera. He's sitting there in the Opera House Unter den Linden. And then we ended up at, the Paris Exposition in 1889 and with Mahler at the end. And I think that has taught me not to think of history kind of linearly. And it was the same thing with the Emily Dickinson show. It was, we're not going to talk about the beginning, her birth to her death. It was, I think we opened on her interest in horticulture or something. I don't know. But creative approaches to talking about songs and to talking about things that could be maybe just chronologically, interesting, but it's more interesting to kind of chop it up and have vignettes.
Well, I think we were trying to show that song either is a diary or the other way around, a radar. Anybody else comfortable or not comfortable? Laura, what was you?
I love the opportunity to actually use songs to tell history and history to say something about songs. And I found that, I still find that a fascinating project to do. But the thing actually that I remember in terms of feedback I got on one of the many drafts of my script was the point at which I really thought I needed to put a Webern song in. And I think what I was told is that you can't put that in. People will drive off the road if they hear Webern on the radio, which was good for me to hear.
Which Webern was it?
I can't remember. It wasn't anything terribly out of the ordinary. It was. We
had a couple of thorny pieces in the series. I'm surprised that came up.
But it was quite good for me as a sort of writing my sort of scholarly orientated history, where I thought, of course you have to have Webern in there. You can't not. But actually, to say from a radio point of view, you need to think about what situations people are listening to this in, what kinds of things people will accept, and actually how you present them. And so that was a good sort of learning experience for me in terms of thinking about the way we present repertoire and actually what is acceptable for certain situations and not for others. So that was a challenge, but I learned something there.
I love Webern songs. Anyway, yes, Drew, we had a mantra that said, these shows are for people driving home after work, mostly on I-95. They've got to. We want to keep them focused. We want to tell them a proper story. We don't want to beat them over the head. We want it to be an experience as they're stuck in their car that's essentially enlightening and pleasing at the same time. I don't want anybody to feel like we were trying to dumb down anything. We were just always trying to be very, very sensitive that people would be listening to most people would be listening to this show in the shows while they're driving someplace, while they're doing something else, where they've got something else on their minds, and they might recheck it. But anyway, it was point well made. Ben, what did you think? Were you handcuffed?
No, a lot of the concert projects that I do are kind of similar to this, where you have to come up with just the right thing to say or image to show or way to frame a song. So I really kind of felt, I was really excited by the opportunity to do this, on a grander scale, to reach more people with this kind of project. I think I mentioned when we talked last month that for me, projects often begin with a very specific thing, a particular song, let's say, and then they radiate outwards. Whereas here, the assignment was, you have to deal with the 1840s, and how do you eventually crystallize that into specific examples? And so the choosing of the repertoire was a very agonizing experience. And similarly, in terms of boiling things down, I think the challenge to write in shorter sentences will be a lifelong struggle for me when it's called for. And this was a case where it was called for, but I was happy to have a chance to practice that.
Well said. Susan, I can remember, you're muted. I can remember some conversations with you where we were very concerned to say, this is fabulous, Professor Youens. It's why I love your books. But this, I can't, we gotta, and I remember, it's along these same lines, but I remember you giggling. I remember you laughing. I mean, you were just such a good sport, and sort of saying, "Oh, I see what you mean. Oh, yes. Well, I have to. Oh, yes. Of course. One day." It was your giggle at the idea that your verbosity actually wasn't going to work, and I say the word verbosity with such undying admiration, as you well know. Anyway, I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but was it a fun experience?
It was actually a wonderful experience. I always thought that writing program notes, which I did for decades, was an experience in condensation like no other. You have to pick what are the most important things you want someone to know about this song when they hear it. And it took that experience even further. But the thing I loved the most about that program was feeling justified in my lifelong conviction that song is a player in the world, that it reflects and participates in religion, history, politics, war, revolution, workers' unions, the history of sexuality, you name it, it's there. And at the time I was working on that program, I was coming under a fair amount of criticism for not writing about song as pure music. You analyze it for its musical operations. And I, from the very beginning, have been fascinated by the backstories to song and think that those are important to tell. So your program really sort of made me feel legit in pursuing that approach, for which I'm very grateful.
Oh, you're an angel. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, these programs, these series that we're talking about, the radio series, are available. I don't mean to be shameless about that, but if you're driving a curiosity from this, especially you students, this is a wonderful reference. They're online on the hamsongfoundation.org website. You can listen to all these magnificent shows that these wonderful authors wrote, and some others as well passing by. So we're not talking about any abstract. This is a good reference point for you. Chris, sorry, Susan.
If there's one other thing I could mention about the experience of doing that program, I love the conversations that composers have with each other in their works. So what happens when you throw a boulder as big as Wagner into the musical lake? The ripples take many forms and many guises. So tracing some of that is also a fascinating exercise.
It's fantastic. Your show, you know, Wolf never got his operatic dream together, and Wagner didn't really conquer the song medium. I mean, he wrote some beautiful songs, and you know, the Wesendonck notwithstanding. But isn't it interesting but Wagner's influence was just so unbelievably powerful, and gave us so much of what Wolf is, and Wolf's ability to create in word and tone pictures of life never found a macro form that worked. Isn't that interesting? It's just kind of fascinating to me. You illuminated that beautifully in your show. Christy, what do we do now? Where do you want to go?
Well, I think Susan was leading us a little bit back to this question that we sort of wanted to let everyone riff on to close, which was about the idea of empathy through song, because I think that came up in almost all of your conversations in some form. And I think I'd love to hear from everyone. You know, you're just talking, Susan, about kind of the backstories. The songs are not just art objects, but what is so interesting is all of these layers behind it as well. Although the song itself does often elicit an emotional reaction without having that backstory too, which makes you, you know, dig into it. So, you know, we like to justify our work as well. And Thomas and I absolutely believe that songs are vehicles for empathy, which is something that's very much lacking in our culture in many ways today. So I guess we want to ask all of you kind of, why should we care about songs? I mean, I know why we should, but everyone's kind of thoughts on that, your own personal feeling. Who would like to start?
Who wants to raise their timid finger?
I will.
Thank you.
Thanks, Susan.
I think there are probably more, but there are at least three reasons why I think song is the perfect instrument for empathy. And one of them is that the singer is the instrument. And the singer faces us directly and expresses a piece of music, the composer's reading of it, their reading of it, the pianist's reading of it, with a directness that I don't think you get anywhere else. String quartets, for example, are an intimate genre too, but the way in which quartet players sit on stage facing each other, forming a kind of bubble, is not the same thing as a singer and a pianist on stage. And there's also something about the way the pianist responds to the singer with the kind of focus that we all wish we could have, right? The sort of attentive collaboration.
Right.
And finally, I always used to tell my students that songs may be small in terms of real estate, but they cut deep. And in part, this is because of a mass accumulation of details and nuances that by the end of a song often turn our knees to water and our hearts to mush. I remember the first time I ever really listened to Der Leiermann. and was bowled over by those hollow fifths at the beginning that tell us that something fateful is happening before a single word is sung, by the warped echoes between the hurdy-gurdy player and the singer, by the restriction to a single harmony, by the immense span of that last question, by the ending that isn't an ending. And at the end of it, the experience of that we've all had of isolation and alienation, and of desperately longing for someone with whom to share the music, it just punched me 100-fold in the gut. And that's what songs do with whatever experience they have to convey. And I don't think any other genre does it with the same power.
Thank you. Beautiful. That's why you're Susan Youens. Who wants to follow in those magnificent footsteps? Come on, be brave. There you go, Ben. Come on.
Someone asked.
Well done. Yeah.
So with that being said, there are two things I would add to that. One is that, well, there's two things that relate to one idea, which is that songs are not opera arias. And that's a useful comparison for a couple of reasons. One of them is that an opera aria is sung by a character who you're supposed to believe is the protagonist of the aria that's being sung. But there's a degree to which in song, even in the most conventional, traditional song recital format, wearing a tuxedo and it's a formal concert hall setting, that if I'm singing, that I, the real me, is singing to you. And that too is a fiction because there's me as a performer and there's the real me off stage and then there's whatever the song is projecting, but there's a blurriness between the different personas that you're seeing. And part of that is something more personal, more intimate, more real, and less obviously a fiction. And it has to do, again, with facing the audience and all that kind of thing. I mean, opera singers often face the audience too, but their commitment is to this dramatic world. So the way that all song, but art song included, seems to have more connection to the people making it, to their real selves, that invites you to participate more maybe with your real self. The other one is that, in an opera, an aria usually has a very specific dramatic function in most genres and times and places in opera. In song, I think a lot of songs don't make sense, that there's something about them that's enigmatic, that doesn't make sense, and that's good. Or they're a little too vague, or they're a little too suggestive. It's not prose that they're setting, it's poetry. And so these words mean many different things. You can't say definitively this is what it is. And therefore that leaves this ambiguity, allows people to come in and identify with it in their own way. If I've had a certain experience that day, that year, and then I hear a song on a given day that is ambiguous enough to allow me into it, and not simply to be talked to, but that my listening also participates in the meaning that's created, then there's more intimacy, which could lead to more empathy.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Well, we might as well do girl, boy, Laura.
I was thinking about the empathy question, and I think, like all kinds of art, the idea that it can give you glimpses into other people's worlds and experiences is really vital to song and part of its richness. But thinking about it not as a performer, and actually not in terms of live performance, but my first experiences with song was through recordings. And I think with all kinds of songs, not just lieder, but popular song and many other genres, you do get a real sense of ownership over songs. So there's both empathy with others, but also a sense that this song is, I have my own understanding of it. It's ambiguous. I'm not sure I entirely understand it, as Ben just said, but there's something about it that's mine, and that's very precious. And that's part of returning to it and trying to think, okay, now at this stage in my life, what do I make of it? Whereas 20 years ago, what did I think about it? So that's also something that I think is really powerful about engaging with song.
Well said. Beautiful. Stephen, wrap us up.
The honor of going last. Well, two words we've heard a lot, I think, are in these responses are collaboration and intimacy. And there's something, in terms of collaboration, there's something about the collaboration between a composer and a poet that I find really fascinating. And what I'm often trying to do, whether I'm singing a song or analyzing it or just listening to it, preparing it for a class, is try to understand what was the composer hearing in the poet's words? How was the composer kind of communing with the poet? And there's so many different ways to do that, right? And that, of course, happens in other art forms. Opera combines words and music, but there's something about the intimacy of that encounter between poet and composer. And in terms of empathy, I'm trying to imagine what the composer was thinking about the poet's words. And I find that kind of two-step process of empathizing really fascinating. And that is what keeps me coming back to song, trying to listen carefully enough to understand what the composer might have been hearing, understanding, feeling in the words of someone else. So they're already collaborating, and I feel like I get to be a kind of bystander listening to their very intimate conversation.
Well, well said. Well wrap up. Christy, you want to add something?
Ben made me think of, you were talking about how the person is equated with the piece that was performed. I once performed the Barrio Sequenza at a concert, and before the concert I was speaking with some of the public, and after the concert everyone parted ways when I came into the it really is the phenomena that people equate the performer with the piece. But it's really so inspiring to listen to all of you. Susan, did you want to say something? Okay. It's wonderful. Yeah.
My favorite Barrio stories, and when Barrio made those, Luciano Barrio is who we're talking, the composer. He wrote Mahler transcriptions. He wrote orchestrations of early Mahler songs, and I had the pleasure of singing them for the first time with him. And he actually invited me to go down to Italy and do a tour. It was mostly his music, Sequenza, which was, kind of out there, and the publics were rather modest. But we also sang some very beautiful Mahler songs in his orchestrations. And in one place, after the concert, we were all sort of wandering off towards dinner, and this woman came up and said, maestro, and finally got Barrio. Barrio wasn't the most gregarious for his fans afterwards. He wasn't rude, but it was just, let's do something. And so he finally stopped and turned around, and this woman looked at him and said, Maestro Mahler, your songs, your music, it's incredible. Maestro Mahler, I've never heard such things. They're fantastic. And Barrio, without even missing a beat, said, Ma grazie, signora, and took the program and signed Gustav Mahler and handed it back to her. I thought that was just fantastic. He was a wonderful human being. Oh, my goodness. Ladies and gentlemen, if you ever needed an hour of support and inspiration, why song can be such an endlessly interesting, I even hate the word genre, interesting adventure. Take a song, take a poem, take a music, take a composer, take a poet. You've heard it in this 5. And that was the whole idea of this Happy Holidays Roundtable. I really deeply admire you all, and I'm very grateful that you would join us for this last hurrah in 2020 and move on. Thank you for your work. What we didn't get a chance to talk about, which means that we're going to have another roundtable pretty soon, is what you're working on now and where the directions you find your lives taking in this endless fascination with song. This is our last Beyond Song and Beyond for 2020. The good news is we'll be back on January 5. Is that right? January 5. Now, I just had a thought. It's December 15, so January 5 is essentially 26 days away. So why don't you challenge yourselves, especially you younger song people, and literally every day find a new composer, a new poet. Now, that may sound not possible, but 26 is not a very daunting number. So why don't you just every day find a poem, a poet, and look at their songs, find a composer and look at their songs. And at the end of the day, you'll have 26 of them. Now, I realize that's not going to happen on Christmas Day and probably not even New Year's Day because you'll be hungover. So you don't have to deal with 24 or maybe 23. But go to IDAGIO.com and drop your needle and drop it often and drop it deep and have a happy holiday. And the most important thing, people, stay safe. Stay healthy. This whole series was born out of bringing public, musicians, artists, and the arts very close together as a galvanizing support in hard and good times. We're still in them, and we're still here. We're going to get through it. Be safe. Have a great holiday. Embrace whoever you are allowed to embrace. And by all means, share a song. Good night.